Well, hello everyone, and thank you for attending our Zoom panel session, Faith Among Black Americans, a survey-based study with a qualitative component on African American religion. My name is Kahari Brown. I'm the president-elect of Triple SR and the moderator for what promises to be an exciting talk and discussion about this groundbreaking study. With us for the next hour and a half to discuss the study, we have Bashir Muhammad, Kiana Cox, Ryan Cobb, and Willis Johnson. Bashir Muhammad is a senior researcher at the Pew Research Center and the lead investigator for this study. Kiana Cox, a research associate at the Pew, also played an instrumental role in ensuring the success of the study. And as a quick aside, Bashir and Kiana recently published the results of the study on the Pew's website. And while today's talk will touch on some elements of this paper, I suggest anyone with even a passing interest in African American religion, which I suspect we all do, to read their report. In my estimation, it's the most comprehensive report on African American religion in the 21st century. Moving on, Ryan Cobb was a consultant on this study. He's also an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Georgia. And we have with us Willis Johnson, a fellow at the Bridge Alliance Foundation and Walker Leadership Institute, Eden Seminary. He's also an adjunct faculty member at Methodist Theological School of Ohio and pastor of Living Tree Church in Columbus, Ohio. Now, as a standard procedure for these types of talks, Bashir and Kiana will present their work. I'll then allow Ryan and Willis to pose questions and express their thoughts on the study. I'll then open it up for you all in attendance to ask questions. And what I ask is that you please chat your questions and I'll read them. All right, okay, Bashir and Kiana, you can take it away.
Thank you, Kahari. You neglected to mention that you were also one of the advisors for this project. I don't know if you're trying to distance yourself from us or what, but yeah, you were one of the advisors on this thing too. So yeah, we appreciate that as well. So, as Kahari said, Kiana and I recently completed the Pew Research Center's most comprehensive look at religion among Black Americans. And in fact, our most comprehensive look at African Americans at all. Now, a dedicated study like this is really helpful, I think, because it allowed us both to design questions that deal with issues that are most relevant to Black Americans, and also allowed us to get a sample that's large enough to really look at really interesting subgroups, to get beyond sort of the broad strokes of, well, Black Americans are more religious than Americans of other races, and really dig into questions about, well, what does that look like for different groups? What about Black Catholics? What about religiously unaffiliated Black Americans? What about Gen Z? So we were able to really unpack, what about African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants? So we were really able to unpack some of these things. So I'm gonna talk for a few minutes and about some of the methodology about how we went about this and some of the decisions and findings related specifically to Black congregations. And then I'll hand it over to Dr. Cox, who will talk some more about some of the subgroups that we found and some of the other more nuanced findings. Before I go too far, I do want to take a minute to say a word or two about Pew Research Center for those of you that aren't familiar. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit, non-advocacy fact tank, which is to say that like everyone on this call, we firmly believe that facts matter and are important in figuring out sort of advocacy and decision-making roles, but we don't go into decisions about prescriptions, about what should happen next, which should be pretty familiar to most of the folks on this call, right? Most academics also have at least some sense of a line between like, well, this is sort of a purely academic finding, and this is moving more into advocacy, even though many of us play both of those roles. In terms of the survey itself, we had an overall sample of over 8,000 Black respondents. Not a total sample of 8,000 respondents, but of 8,000 respondents who identified as Black or African American. We also had a smaller sample of a few thousand non-Blacks for comparisons on a few questions. But just looking at Blacks or African Americans, we had over 8,000 respondents. And we did this using a variety of sources, because no one source that we had access to had that large a sample. A lot of the Pew Research Center's work is done with what we call the American Trends Panel, which is a group of respondents who have agreed to do surveys every month or two that have been nationally selected, randomly selected to represent the nation writ large. And those people are the main source for most of our studies. But we knew that if we just surveyed them, we wouldn't get enough Black respondents to really dig in. As you can see from this sample, from that study, from just looking at the American Trends Panel, we get a little over 1,000 Black respondents. So then we went to other sources to look and see where else we could get additional respondents. So we reached out to NORC, which does the AmeriSpeaks panel, which some of you may be familiar. It's another nationally representative panel of respondents. It's not an opt-in panel. And that they had a little over 1,000 respondents. We reached out to Ipsos, which does the knowledge panel. At one point, GFK was doing that. Some of you may be familiar with it from then. And they had a bit over 2,000 Black respondents. So altogether, from all of the panels, we had almost 5,000 Black respondents. But we felt like that still wasn't enough. We sort of did the analysis of like what that would get us, and that still wasn't enough for us to look at some of the groups that were of interest. For example, with just 5,000 Black respondents, we weren't sure that we'd be able to do analysis on Black Catholics. We weren't sure that we'd be able to do analysis on African immigrants. And so we did an additional recruitment, a fresh set of recruitment of nearly 4,000 respondents. Now, these people weren't already impaneled, and so it required a multi-step process. So you'll see like field periods are very different, right? For the first three, the field period is just a few weeks, because these are folks who are all on panels already. The last one, the field period is many months, because these were new respondents that we didn't know anything about. And so there's a first set of mailings that we send out using the Postal Service's list of addresses, residential addresses in the US. And then from those mailings, we invite people to take a short screener survey. And people who complete that survey and identify as Black or African American were invited to take a longer survey. And so that got us to a sample that was large enough to look at most of the groups that we were most interested in. Another point I want to make about the survey is the mode. So most of this sampling, most of the survey was done online, but we were aware, of course, that not everyone has access to internet, not everyone's online, not everyone's comfortable taking surveys online. And not only that, but there's been data that shows that African Americans in particular are somewhat underrepresented on surveys that are really focused online for a whole host of reasons, which we can talk about maybe in the Q&A. And so we felt it was important to have other modes in addition to online. And so the NORC AmeriSpeaks panel does telephone interviews for anyone who's uncomfortable who isn't comfortable doing it online. And the new recruitment, the 3,600 new respondents, had the option to do it by paper. So the initial invite was sent by mail, and it asked people to go online if they were comfortable with it. But if they weren't, we would just mail them a paper packet to fill out and send back in. And all of this was to make sure that the sample was as representative as possible of the diversity of Black American religious experiences. So, we're talking about Black American life, Black American religious experiences. And one important aspect of that, of course, is the Black church. And typically when people talk about that, they're talking about historically Black Protestant denominations in particular, and some of the distinctive things in terms of the history and the engagement that those denominations have had. Now, of course, even with that relatively narrow definition, we have to realize that the Black church isn't just a monolith. It's not just one thing. There's a whole lot of diversity in there in terms of levels of political engagement, in terms of theology. And so we have to be very cautious when we talk about it. But we knew that we were going to want to talk about Black congregations or the Black church in some way. But it left us with a little bit of a difficulty in terms of how best to measure it. One way that we explored and ultimately did not rely on heavily for this survey, although we have some data that allows secondary analysis in that direction, is just based on denominations. So we asked respondents what denomination they're a part of. And this wasn't just a simple open-ended, what is your religion, what is your denomination, fill it in. It was a series of branching questions where we'd ask people broadly what their religion was: Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, Jewish. There's sort of a list of about a dozen broad categories. And then within those categories, if you said Protestant, for example, we'd ask about denominational families. Well, do you identify as Baptist or Methodist or a whole wide range of those things, another sort of dozen or so possibilities. And then within that, we went through and we said, okay, if you identify as Baptist, well, what sort of Baptist is that? Is that the Progressive National Baptist Convention? Is that the Southern Baptist Convention? So we really pushed people to give us as much detail as they could in terms of denomination. Even doing that, what we found is that many people either don't know their denomination or don't affiliate with a specific denomination. So of the people, of the Protestants that we surveyed, only about a quarter, 23%, identified with what you'd call the sort of historically Black Protestant denominations, some of the ones that the folks are most familiar with. And another 30% identify with an evangelical or mainline denomination. So they told us the name of a specific denomination, but it's clearly identifiable as like, no, this is an evangelical denomination. This is a mainline Protestant denomination. But all the rest, which accounts for about half of the respondents, did neither of those. Either they explicitly said, no, I'm non-denominational, I don't have a denomination, or all they said is something broad, which doesn't let us put them into a specific denomination. So they said they're Baptist, and that may be the Progressive National Baptist Convention, or it may be Southern Baptist. So just because they're Baptist doesn't tell us that they're in a Black church. And so we had that information, but we didn't just say, okay, well, if you're Baptist and you're Black, well, then you're in a Black church, because we know that's not always the case. And one of the things that we wanted to understand is what's the difference in experience for a Black person that's in a Black church versus in a white church. And so we couldn't rely just on denominational affiliation. The other reason why we were hesitant to rely too heavily on denominational affiliation is something that came up in our focus groups, which is that even folks who go to what, as scholars, we would most clearly say is a Black church, often are uncomfortable with calling it that, with sort of seeing it in that light. So this is a quote from one respondent who was a regular attendee at an AME Zion affiliated church. And this person says that he's not comfortable saying he goes to a Black church. And so even just sort of asking people, well, do you go to a Black church or not, isn't going to work in a survey. If folks who are going to AME Zion churches where everybody in the congregation is Black, where the pastor's Black, are still gonna be like, well, but I don't go to a Black church. And so we knew that wasn't really an option. We also knew that we had to be a little careful in how we phrase our questions to be sensitive to that. So what we wound up doing in terms of trying to measure this issue was we asked people about the race of the attendees and about the race of the leadership of the congregation. And if the leadership was Black and the attendees were mostly Black, then we called it a Black church. So that was the way that we decided analytically through our report to think about Black churches. Again, there are other ways we can do it, and we have in the data set, there are other options that we'll look at and that I expect that subsequent researchers will look at. But if people were going to a church where the leadership was Black, the congregation was Black, we called that a Black church. If they were going to a congregation where the leadership was some non-Black race, so leadership was white and the congregation was white, we called that a white church. And if there was if they said that like there's no one group that made a majority, we called that a multiracial church. Now there's some additional categories that are sort of built into what we use. So for example, throughout the report, we talk about white and other race churches. Now, mostly these are white churches, about 8 and 10 of them are just white churches. But there also were some folks who are like, you know, my pastor is Asian and everyone else in the congregation is Asian. There weren't enough of those for us to say, you know, Asian churches as a separate category, or, you know, the pastor's Hispanic and most of the members are Hispanic. There weren't enough of those to say to talk about Hispanic churches. So we just talked about white or other race churches, which are churches where some group other than Blacks make up the majority of the congregation and also the leadership. And similarly with multiracial churches, mostly it was people who said that no one group forms a majority, but there are also some people who said, for example, you know, we have a Black pastor, but a white, but most of the congregation is white. Or we have a white pastor, but most of the congregation is Black. And those folks are also in our multiracial churches category. Although most of the multiracial category, about 73%, are people who said that there's no single group that makes up the majority. There are also these folks where the majority congregation and the leadership are mismatched in that way. And again, we can talk some more in the Q&A about the reasons why we made those decisions. Now, jumping into the actual data briefly, what did we find, you know, using these definitions? We found that 2/3 of Black Protestants that attend religious services go to a Black congregation. About 1 in 10 go to a congregation where whites or some other group are the majority, and about a fifth, 22%, go to a multiracial congregation. Now, Black congregations, as you might expect, are much less common among Catholics. Only about 17% of Black Catholics say they go to a Black congregation by this definition. And if you look at other faiths, whether you're talking about non-Christian faiths like Islam or Muslims, or even we had respondents from other Christian faiths, Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. Among those groups, they're somewhere in between. About a third say that they go to a Black congregation, and about half go to multiracial congregations, and about 1 in 5, 17%, say they go to a congregation where whites or some other group form the majority. And I think, you know, that other faiths is kind of a hodgepodge, and we can disaggregate that in, I think, interesting ways. Although, even with our large sample, we do run into some sample size issues, which, but we can talk some about what disaggregating that other faiths category looks like some in the Q&A. But among Protestants, at least, which make up the majority of Black Americans, about 2/3 say that they go to a Black congregation. Interestingly, though, most Black Americans, including those who say that they go to a Black church, also say that they think congregations that have historically been mostly Black should work to become more racially and ethnically diverse. So on the one hand, we see this data saying that there is a sort of vibrancy to Black congregations, to Black churches. But on the other hand, sort of people are uncomfortable saying that, like, I just go to a Black church, as you saw in the quote, or saying that they want their church or other churches to remain Black. You know, we had different question that asked, if you were looking for a new congregation, how important would the race of the pastor or the race of the membership be? And actually, it wasn't very important. Most people, again, even folks who go to Black churches, did not rank that as an important factor. A lot of other factors were much more important. And I think there are a lot of reasons why we see that, why we see people going to Black congregations, but at the same time saying that that this sort of racial exclusionary, that they don't want this to be racially exclusionary, and saying that they want to see these congregations diversified. You know, some of that has to do with you know, religious, cultural capital, and just sort of people going to congregations that they've gone to in the past. And we definitely see that people who have growing up, going to Black churches are much more likely to go to Black churches as adults. Some of that probably is social desirability bias and you know, people just not wanting to say certain types of things, although we took a number of steps to mitigate that. But another aspect is that these congregations were distinctive. These Black churches were distinctive in ways other than the sort of racial makeup. For example, they're distinctive in terms of the style of worship. Among Black Protestant churches, nearly universally, there's a sort of call and response. 99% of Black Americans who go to Black churches said that this sort of calling out of amen or expressions of approval is something that they see at their congregation. Pentecostal practices of various sorts are also more common among Black churches, although certainly not universal. There's some interesting denominational splits there that we could talk about. But there's a distinctiveness in terms of the style of worship between Black churches and white churches in particular, or multiracial churches even. That may be part of the reason why some Black Americans, especially those who've grown up in Black churches, feel more comfortable there and sort of go there, sort of prefer to go there. There's also distinctiveness in terms of the content of the sermons. And this is something else that we heard a good amount of in the focus groups that we did. We heard people talking about, well, I go to this church because they speak to our issues. They speak to our concerns. And we see some distinctiveness in terms of the content of the sermons. Black churches are much more likely to have a sermon that talks about race relations or racial inequality. They're much more likely to have a sermon that talks about criminal justice reform. They're more likely to have sermons about voting or political engagement. They're a little less likely than white churches to have a sermon about abortion. And so there's a distinctive content of the sermon in addition to distinctive style of worship that may be drawing 2/3 of Black Protestants to go to Black churches. But the other thing that's important to note, and this is going to be sort of the last point that I make, is that while we definitely see a continued vibrancy of Black churches, we also see some signs of that may be of concern, some signs of decline. One is generation, and the main one here is generational. We see that the youngest Black Americans are the least likely to say that they go to a Black church. And the oldest Black Americans are the ones that are most likely to say they go to a Black church. And there are at least two reasons for that. One is, of course, that we see among Black Americans, like among other races, younger folks are less likely to go to church at all. And so if they're not going to church, then they're not going to a Black church because they're just not going anywhere. But the other is that even those who go to church often are more likely to not go to a Black church. The youngest Blacks are more likely than the oldest to say that they go to a church where whites or some other group are the majority. Although it's still only, even among the youngest, it's only about 13% of Black Americans that say that they're going to a white church or a church where some other group is the majority. That's still significantly higher than we see among older Black adults. So there's a difference here in terms of both comfort with going to white churches and also with willingness to go to church at all. I'm going to stop here and hand it over to Kiana so she can talk about some of the other findings in this study.
Thanks, Bashir. Let's switch the screens. There we go. So now I'd like us to talk about some of our findings related to religious beliefs and practices among Black Americans. In this survey, let's make sure I can, there we go. So in this survey, we asked Black Americans to share with us their beliefs about God. So not only sort of do you believe in God, but what do you believe about God? I call this sort of the content of that belief. And so what we found is that an overwhelming majority of Black Americans say that they believe in God or some other kind of higher power. So that's at 97%. But when we disaggregate that belief, we see that about 3/4 of Black Americans say that they specifically believe in the God of the Bible or some other holy book or religious scripture of major religions. But we also see that about 1/5 of Black Americans say that they believe in some kind of higher power that isn't described in one of those holy books. And then about 2% say they don't believe in any kind of higher power at all. So we see that belief in God, sort of this foundational belief, is very widespread, although the content of that belief is a little bit different. And I'll get into that a little bit more later in terms of who's more likely to believe on what kind of level. But overall, belief in God is very high. The other thing related to belief, and so we wanted to know, aside from belief, what are the types of things that Black Americans say are essential to their faith if they are affiliated with a religion, or their sense of morality if they aren't affiliated with a religion? And so, not surprisingly, given what we just saw, that believing in God is essential to the faith or sense of morality of the vast majority of Black Americans. So we have about 85% of Black Americans who say that belief in God is essential to what practicing their faith means to them. However, the other things that we see that are really high up there in this list of things that are essential to Black Americans' sense of faith and morality is, number one, opposing racism. So we see that about 3/4 of Black Americans say that opposing racism is essential to their faith or their sense of morality. Right under that is opposing sexism. So we have these three things kind of stacked up at the top, right? Belief in God, opposing racism, and opposing sexism. Notice that those two social justice issues outpace other types of both religious practice and other things that we usually see go hand in hand with sort of devout religiosity. So opposing racism and opposing sexism are more essential to the faith or morality of Black Americans than going to church or attending religious services. It's more essential than avoiding premarital sex, and it's also more essential than opposing abortion. So those are the things that we're seeing in terms of, like I said, the content of this belief. Believing in God is essential, but also these other sort of social justice issues are also essential to Black American sense of faith or morality. If we continue to talk about religious practice, right? So we just looked at belief, what's essential to that belief. When it comes to religious practice, we see that prayer plays a number of different roles in the lives of Black Americans. First of all, in terms of general frequency of prayer, we see that 83% of Black Americans say that they pray once or twice a month or more. So just general prayer is very widespread, but also nearly 80% of Black Americans also say that they believe that prayer has the power to heal sickness and disease, to heal illness or injury, or as they say in the church, to heal your body. So prayer is important to Black Americans in that regard. We also see that Black Americans rely on prayer a lot or a great deal in terms of what they use in order to make decisions about their personal lives. So they rely on about half, a little more than half actually, 56%, say that they rely on prayer and personal religious reflection before they make major decisions in their lives. I think it's important to note that they rely on personal prayer more than they rely on advice from professionals like a therapist, and more than they rely on advice from even their ministers or people who they ascribe religious authority to. So this personal sense of prayer is important just in general in terms of frequency, important because of how people believe it heals them, but also important in terms of guiding their life. The other thing that we found about prayer is that about 1/3 of Black Americans specifically believe that prayer to their ancestors will help protect them from harm in their lives. And if we unpack that a little bit, we see that about half of Black adults who are affiliated with non-Christian religions believe this, but also half of Black Catholics believe that as well, in terms of believing that prayer to ancestors specifically can help protect you. Only 1/3 of Black Protestants believe in that particular application or aspect of prayer. So prayer plays this multifaceted role in the lives of Black Americans, according to what we found. The other thing that we wanted to discuss, and Bashir mentioned this earlier, is that having such a large sample of almost 9,000 Black Americans allows us to unpack some of these subgroups that we don't always get a chance to talk about in the study of religion. So one of the groups that we looked at first was what we call the religiously unaffiliated. And so for us, we define that as people who identify as atheists, agnostic, or say their religion is nothing in particular. And one of the things that stuck out to us is how widespread belief in God is among this religiously unaffiliated group. And so we find that about 90% of Black Americans who are religiously unaffiliated say that they believe in God or some other kind of higher power. It is important to note that, again, this religiously unaffiliated group is composed of people who identify as atheists, agnostic, and those who say their religion is nothing in particular. So it's important to note that this belief in God is primarily being driven by that last group of people, the people who say that their religion is nothing in particular. In many ways, their level of belief in God is in the, I think it's at 94%. So in many ways, their level of belief in God is almost as high as Black Protestants is. So it's those people, among the unaffiliated, those who say their religion is nothing in particular, it's those people who have this higher level of belief in God that's really driving this pattern among them and pushing that pattern. We also found that the majority of Black Americans who are unaffiliated with the religion pray a few times a month or more, so about 60% say that they pray, and that also a sizable minority attends religious services at least once a year, so about 20% of them do that. And so what we're saying is that even among Black people who say that they are unaffiliated with the religion, we're finding that for certain segments of that group, they are still very religiously engaged. They may not identify with a major religion or subscribe to or say, I am a Protestant, I am a Baptist, etc. But several of them do still have religious beliefs that on some levels are similar to Black Protestants. And really quickly before I go from this slide, about atheists, when it comes to atheists and agnostics, we see that they are much less likely to believe in any of these practices or to engage in any of these beliefs. So we see that no more than 1 in 6 atheists and agnostics say that they pray at all or that they pray to their ancestors, and very few of them also attend religious services once a year or more. So overall, the religiously unaffiliated are fairly religious by our measures. One of the other subgroups that we were able to take a look at were African and Caribbean immigrants. And so we found that there are differences in religiosity and religious belief based on nativity. So for example, Black adults who were born in Africa are more likely than those who were born in the United States or the Caribbean to say that religion is very important in their personal lives and to attend religious services frequently. So we're seeing that African immigrants on those two measures are more religious than Black adults born in the United States or the Caribbean. So religion is personally salient to them and they go to church more often. However, where African immigrants do not differ from Black adults born in the United States is on this question about prayer to ancestors. So we see that about 1/3 of Black adults who were born in Africa, as well as the same share who were born in the United States, say that they believe that prayers to their ancestors can protect them from harm happening in their personal lives. These two groups outpace Black adults who were born in the Caribbean. So that's where the difference is there in terms of prayer to ancestors. It's not African immigrants who stand out, it's actually Caribbean immigrants who stand out, and they are least likely to engage in this kind of prayer. If we look at social issues in terms of religion and nativity, we also see that African immigrants on 2 of our measures related to gender and sexuality are in some ways more socially conservative than Black adults who were born in the United States. So for example, those born in Africa are less likely to say, that mothers and fathers should divide family finances equally. They are also less likely to say that homosexuality should be accepted in society. So by having this large sample, we're able to unpack sort of these nuanced differences in religious belief and behavior based on nativity. One of the other subgroups that we were able to look at from having had this sample is differences between Black Protestants and Catholics. And so, excuse me, one of the things that we see from our data is that if we compare Black Protestants and Catholics, we see that only about half of Catholics say that religion is very important in their personal lives compared to 3/4 of Black Protestants. So on this level of salience or religion being an important factor in people's lives, Catholics are less likely than Protestants to say that. One of the other areas where we see Black Catholics differ from Protestants is what they say about same-sex relationships. So they are about twice, Black Catholics that is, are about twice as likely to say that their religious leaders should be able to perform marriage ceremonies for same-sex couples. More broadly, Black Catholics are more likely to say that homosexuality should be accepted in society in general. They are more likely to say that. So about 80% of Black Catholics say that homosexuality should be accepted in society compared to 60% of Black Protestants. So we see that there are some differences there in terms of Catholics and Protestants, not only in terms of their level of religiosity, but also in sort of this extension of religious beliefs into when it comes to social issues. Catholics are more likely to say that their religious leaders should be able to perform same-sex marriage ceremonies. They're also more likely to say that same-sex relationships should be accepted in society in general. Where they don't differ is on this question of gender and leadership. So nearly 90% of both Black Catholics and Protestants say that women should be able to be the senior religious leader of a congregation. So for example, Black Protestants would say to this question, yes, Black women should be able to be a senior pastor at a church, for example. So they don't differ on that question of gender. So our sample allowed us to disaggregate those subgroups. We learned that the religiously unaffiliated, at least among Black adults, are, although unaffiliated, still religiously engaged. We learned that African immigrants stand out in terms of their level of religiosity and in terms of their approach to social issues which intersect with religiosity. And we also saw that we see a similar pattern among Black Catholics in terms of their religiosity being different from that of Black Protestants, and also their approach to social issues, at least some of them being different from Protestants as well. Before I turn it back over to Kahari for our discussion, I want to make a few other points about gender, race, and Black churches. So we saw that the large majorities of Black Catholics and Protestants believe that women should be senior leaders of congregations. More broadly, our data shows that the majority of Black Americans attend houses of worship, which emphasize that both men and women should be active members of their congregation. So we see that about 63% of Black Americans say that they go to congregations that say men should be active in church, and that 57% say that they go to congregations that emphasize that women should be active. We found that those differences are not statistically significant. So Black Americans go to congregations where both men and women are stressed where leadership in the congregation is stressed for both men and women. Similarly, if you look at the last line here on this slide, we also see that there's no difference in terms of stressing the involvement of parenting. So Black Americans, about 70% say that they go to congregations where both men and women are, where it's stressed for both of them to be involved parents. This changes though if we look at some other issues about families and leadership and community. So this egalitarian approach doesn't carry over when we talk about family financial responsibility or community leadership. So Black Americans who attend religious services are twice as likely to say that their congregations stress that men should be financial providers in their families versus stressing that women should. So 64% say that their congregations say that men should, 35% say that their congregations stress that women should do this. These houses of worship are also more likely to say that men should be role models in Black communities than women. The difference there is a little bit smaller than the family financial support, but still, these are the two areas where we do see differences in terms of emphasis on gender and leadership, if you will. So men are emphasized in terms of being breadwinners, and they're emphasized in terms of being role models in Black communities. We don't see those same gender differences in terms of congregational involvement or parenting. Although these congregations have different gendered expectations for men and women in families and communities, nearly half of Black Americans overall believe that these institutions have a steady influence in Black communities, and about 40% actually want them to have more influence. So 41% say that Black churches have too little influence in Black communities. Only 10% actually say that these organizations or institutions have too much influence. So despite these, this variety of ways that churches do and don't contribute to gender roles or gender norms, or do or don't conform to those, these are organizations that Black adults feel are either have the right amount of influence in Black communities, or they want them to have more influence. More broadly, Black Americans view Black religious organizations as being sort of a net good in terms of civil rights. So we found that nearly 80% say that Black churches played an important role in advancing equality for Black Americans in terms of civil rights. And about half say the same for Black Muslim organizations, such as the Nation of Islam. And so those are the things that we found in terms of Black churches. There are some different messages in terms of gender and leadership, in terms of what congregations stress, but what we see is that Black Americans feel like these organizations can have more influence, or they're comfortable with the amount of influence that they already have in Black communities. And then if we ask in terms of this historical assessment, we see that Black Americans, the majority of them feel like Black religious organizations have played a key role in advancing equality for Black Americans in the United States. And so if you want to read our full report, please visit us online at pewresearch.org/Black and there you'll be able to see all of the chapters that we have on this report, including the qualitative chapters on the focus groups that Bashir mentioned earlier, as well as interviews with clergy are included there too. And now I want to turn it back over to Kahari for our discussion.
Thank you, Bashir and Kiana. Very interesting. I'm going to ask Ryan and Pastor Johnson. I'm going to apologize to Pastor Johnson earlier for not saying Pastor Johnson. That's my fault.
I hate to pass you.
Okay, all right.
All good.
All right. Well, I want to ask you two your general thoughts about this study, but I want to start with you, Pastor Johnson. My question is just generally what are your thoughts on the study, but more specifically, I'm interested in your thoughts about the relevance and or the application of this study's findings to the work that you do as a senior pastor.
Yeah, well, first of all, to Pew and to our Black genius and intellectuals that have worked diligently on this, thank you. As has been mentioned, it is a very comprehensive work. It still is much to cover, and I think this does an excellent job to open the doors of us at both in our thinking, but also now I think for those of us who are practitioners, it really requires a lot more of us now. I guess my interest has been from this report previously. I think it does a great job of capturing some of the critical what and why. I'm stuck in the how. How do we make this real? And particularly, the question continues that I continue to struggle or strive into with this is, how does this become a tool that is moved, that helps to move the needle? I think there are some, I recognize this as a sociological instrument, and you get the answers to the questions that you ask. And so I'm wondering what I see in numbers and what I see in responses. Anecdotally, in my own experience and with others, I wonder, I don't necessarily see that align in some places in terms of how it's lived out or actualized. I think also there's some things that people may have response to or have given response to that needs to be nuanced. I saw some questions in the chat talking about some of the theological dispositions or dynamics in Black theology that are more maybe sometimes generalized or assumed about the culture of church that may not be fully true. And I think even people who are respondents kind of have a school of fish kind of orientation around how they're responding. But I to that point around just what I see in this, a couple questions around like the extraction of this work, particularly when you talk about the significance of opposing race, the usefulness or the importance of religious communities, Black religious communities, context, serving well the social kind of responsiveness of a community. And yet we often hear that there's not enough engagement, or to what role and extent do people actually play. Lastly, I'm really excited about your work did its best at trying to capture the denominational ambiguity that's out there. I can only speak from my experience and even my tradition that I serve. I've served both as in the Baptist tradition. I'm ordained in the Baptist tradition. I currently serve and work within United Methodism, which is not a historically Black denomination. However, we can get in that another day. But I can tell you, people did not necessarily always attend the churches that I lead and that I've worked in because they were just Baptists. And most of the people who are in my New Start church that is supported by the United Methodists have no inclination nor care and don't even affiliate in any real way with that. So understanding what is the expanding definition of Black and Black church would continue to be kind of the places where I like to drive in. But I've taken this report both as a practitioner and even as one who looks at practical theology and practices in the classroom, and say, okay, now we've got to really retool ourselves, because maybe a lot of what either people are saying and expecting or sensing, either we need to give greater clarity and nuance to, or we might be getting a pass. And we need to take this passing grade and see if we can upgrade it and elevate it in terms of our work product.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to give, you raised some very important points. I mean, one of the things that I hear is this question about how do we make social science research, and specifically today we're talking about social science research on African American religion. How do we make it relevant to the everyday lives of people, of the people that we're studying? This is extremely important question. I'm going to give Bashir and Kiana just a brief amount of time to address his question, and then we'll move on to Ryan.
Okay, I mean, I guess I'll start it, and then
Yeah.
kind of if you want to jump in afterwards and correct whatever nonsense I say wrong. So I agree. I absolutely agree. You know, that this is a key question, and I think it ties onto a question that I saw in the Q&A about you know, what our plan was in terms of reaching out to denomination leaders and pastors and putting this data in their hands and at their disposal. This is one of those places where the fact that Pew sees itself in a sort of non-advocacy role winds up mattering, because what we can do and what I fervently hope to do and what we've been trying to do is put this data in the right hands, get it to people who can use it for their own goals. You know, get it in the hands of pastors, getting it in the hands of denomination leaders, so that they can, you know, really sort of think through, like, well, what does it mean that I'm, you know, leading this congregation? I'm a white pastor with a set of Black congregants. What does that mean in terms of like what I should be dealing with? You know, I'm leading a historically Black Protestant denomination, a church affiliated with a historically Black Protestant denomination. What does this mean in terms of my ability to sort of reach more broadly in terms of who should be in my congregation? So the goal that I have is really to get this data in their hands, so that they can wrestle with those questions. What we don't do is try to answer those questions ourselves. And there's two reasons for that. I think one is look, I'm not a pastor. So like my opinions on what you should do as a pastor, like, don't listen to them. I'm not a pastor, right? Like, I'm a social scientist. And so I can tell you, I can tell you what the social science says, and then you can move it forward from there. So that's the key thing. But I think the other thing is, sort of Pew, the way Pew sees itself and what it is comfortable. So it's not even comfortable saying that, we want to see more folks in church, or more, Black churches growing or Black churches shrinking. Like, that's not a position that Pew is willing to take, or that I as a representative for Pew can take. So I can say, here's what the data says. If you want to move forward on, well, how do I get Black churches to be bigger and more vibrant or whatever, that, that's all to the good. But I have to be honest and say, I've also talked to folks who, are part of the Black Atheist Association, Black Non-Believers Association. And I can guarantee you that's not their goal. And so, what I have to do is put it in everyone's hands. Okay, well, here's the facts. Here's where the reality is as we can measure it. And whatever your goals are, build on this.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to move on to Ryan. Ryan, you were a consultant on the study. So I'm interested in your thoughts about the extent to which this study may add to what we know about African-American religious life.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Sorry, I said you are a consultant on this study. So I'm interested in your thoughts about the extent to which this study may add to what we know about African-American religious life.
Well, yeah, first, it was a pleasure. Thank you all for inviting me to the panel, as well as being part of the study. It complicates it. And so it complicates in ways that I can't think of any survey that is as complicated since the National Survey of American Life, ran by James Jackson and colleagues at Michigan, in the sense that you all provide, and I hope the chair can talk more about this, multiple measures for Blacks' racial and ethnic identification. And so typically when we see our surveys, the standard race questions, many surveys is, are you Black or African American? But it doesn't get into the nativity, not as many questions about nativity status or country of origin, as well as the parents, as well as the person's spouse, as well as their ability to identify as Latino or multiracial. And that, at least in reading the report and looking at some of the other findings, shows how Black religion is complex for people who self-identify as Black. And so I think one figure that Pew, and Bashir, I'd love for you to talk about this more, showed is that native-born individuals who are native-born African Americans, their religious choices, the types of church that they go to, whether it's a predominantly Black church, multiracial church, or predominantly white church or other church, are different from those who were not born in the United States. Well, is my memory serving me correct, Bashir? And if so, can you comment on that?
Sure. So, yeah, I think so. I think there's a couple of things there. One is that the different sorts of measures that we had, right? So the way that you filtered into this survey is you need to identify as either Black or African American in the standard race question that everybody asks. But that also included folks who are multiracial. So you could say that you identify as Black and also as white, and we're like, okay, well, you're in. We want to analyze your data. You could also identify, as with many sort of questions, we had a separate question for, do you identify as Hispanic or Latino? And if you identified as Black and Hispanic or Black and Latino, you also were in the survey. So that's the first round filter. But beyond that, there are a few other measures that I think are of interest. One is we asked the respondent's country of birth. And then we coded that and reported on it by region. So we asked people about country of birth, and then we reported by region. And so, we were able to break out immigrants, people who are born in sub-Saharan Africa, people who are born in Caribbean countries. We also asked people about the country of birth of their parents, and again, coded that into region. So that's another lens of analysis. Another sort of separate question that we looked at is we asked people if they identified as Afro-Latino or Afro-Hispanic, and some folks, even folks who don't identify as Black, also identify with that. And so so that's another group that we can analyze and talk about, folks who identify as Afro-Latino, and the ones who identify as Afro-Latino and Black, and the ones who identify as Afro-Latino but not Black, and how are they similar or different. So these are all different lenses that either we have used or we can use based on the data. One thing that in the report that we did look at consistently is people who are born in Africa, people who are born in the Caribbean, and people who are born in the US. And what we saw is that in particular, Blacks who are born in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, tended to be more religious by a variety of measures and also more sort of socially conservative by a variety of measures. This is true if you looked at attendance at religious services. This is true if you looked at sort of self-reported importance of religion. It's true if you look at views on homosexuality. It's true if you look at gender responsibilities and sort of how those should be divided, sort of gender roles and sort of dividing up those sorts of things. So on a whole host of measures, we saw these two patterns where they were both more religious and more conservative. So that's just sort of one example of the ways in which we can sort of have a more complex and hopefully more accurate picture of Black American religious life.
Great. Thank you for
If I
sharing.
can say something really quickly.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kiana.
Yeah, somebody asked in the chat a related question, just sort of like the demographic breakdown. So about 90% of the sample were US born Black adults, and about 4% each born in the Caribbean and born in Africa. So that's the breakdown. So about 4% born in Africa, 4% born in the Caribbean, 90% born in the United States.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Johnson, and thank you, Ryan, for your questions. I'm going to turn it over now to everyone else in attendance, and I'm going to read the questions that I received thus far. Okay, so here's a question from Patrick Mason, and Patrick Mason states, first of all, thank you, Patrick, for your question. Patrick states, he's surprised that respondents didn't list National Primitive Baptist Convention as their denominational affiliation. It's not on the list. What do you make of this?
So to be clear, the list I showed wasn't every denomination that anyone said. I actually am almost positive that I did see some respondents that listed that. What this list is the most common ones. They all were coded and they were all sort of collapsed into different groupings. But, there were, out of the 8,000 respondents, there were probably a couple hundred denominations that were named. And I just didn't feel like it would be a useful slide to show you a list of 200 denominations. So these were the most common. But I feel like that one in particular does ring a bell. I remember some respondents did choose that. It just was fewer than 1% of the respondents.
Got it. So that would answer this next question. This next question is from anonymous attendee, and it's basically a similar question as to why Jehovah's Witness was not on the list, or why did you place them in the other faith category? That's the question. I assume it's because of the small numbers of individuals that identified as Jehovah's Witness. Okay, all right. I'm gonna let, if Roman Palatsky is still on this call, I'm gonna let him ask this question about variance in people's social and political beliefs. Roman, are you there? Roman Palatsky? Oh, you can unmute yourself. Oh, let's see. Roman Williams. Is everyone on mute here?
I'm not.
Oh, never mind. I'll ask Roman's question then. Okay, this is the question. What accounts for variance in people's social and political beliefs and attitudes? Is it linked to denominational differences, intrinsic religiosity? That's basically, to what extent does denominational affiliation account for social and political beliefs? I think that's the basis of this question.
There are definitely some differences by denomination. So I've discussed some of them, where some of the biggest breaks are between Protestants and Catholics. But also, if we talk about more traditionally political behavior, one of the major breaks we see is between people who go to religious services and those who don't. So people who go to religious services, now it's not a big difference, but there is a difference in terms. So people who go are more likely to be more civically involved than people who don't go. And then specifically on certain measures, people who are affiliated with non-Christian religions are more likely to, for example, have gone to a protest or a rally than people who are affiliated with other types of religions. So there's the Protestant and Catholic break. There's also the go to church versus don't go to church break in terms of explaining political behavior. And then there's also Christian, non-Christian that are there too. But we have a chapter in the report that helps to break down some of that.
Okay.
One thing I think the other piece that I would want to add to that, that may be of interest, is one aspect that really wasn't a key factor in all of these, which was a lot of these individual measures of religiosity. So, for example, just looking at sort of partisan affiliation, one of the interesting things about a sample this large is we can start talking about Black Republicans, which only make up about 10% of all Blacks. And so most studies are like, most Blacks are Democrats, we're done. And so we were able to look at sort of Black Democrats versus Black Republicans and how they're similar or different. And what we saw is something that's very different from what we see among whites. Among whites, those individual measures of religiosity are pretty tightly linked to partisanship, where Republicans tend to be more religious by a whole host of measures. And that's just not true among Blacks. We don't see a gap between Black Republicans and Black Democrats on these measures of religiosity. Whether we're talking about self-reported importance, frequency of prayer, et cetera. There just isn't a gap. Like, that's not what's sorting people. Whereas for whites, there's a little bit more, those things are more tightly linked.
Got it. Thank you. Okay. Appreciate your response. Next question has to do with prosperity gospel. And this is a two-part question. One, does your survey have measures that capture this idea of prosperity gospel? This idea that if your faith is strong enough, then you will accrue wealth. And if so, what does it say? Do you know what percentage, if you have a question on that, what percentage of the people believe in this theological ideal?
So sadly, the answer to that first question is no.
Got it.
And so we don't get to the second one. Kahari and Ryan, and who were part of those conversations 2 years ago when we were wrestling with this, can speak to this as well as I could. This was a topic that we seriously considered trying to explore and trying to measure. And the reality was we didn't find a question we liked that really we felt like we'd be able to answer this question that we just got and say, it's 17%. Like we went round and round with like, well, what if we phrase it this way? And what if we do this? And what if we make it a forced choice or balanced alternative? And what if we make it a yes, no? And what if we have a Likert scale? And the upshot was there was no question that we could put together that we felt we could defend in the way that we wanted to be able to for this. For just this question that we thought we'd get. And so we're like, we'd rather just not have it than have a question like, well, it's this, but don't really trust it because this. If you were going to design a whole study on it and you were going to have, a battery of 8 questions and maybe a qualitative component, then I think you could really get into this. But we just could not find a question that we felt captured this theological concept in a way that was both true to the concept and recognizable to the laity.
Got it. Thank you. And thank you, Manuela, for asking the question. This is a question from Stephanie House Nyamke. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. But she has a question about the degree to which COVID may have impacted some of your findings. This is a speculative question, but what impact do you think that COVID, and I'll even go even further, the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests, what impact do you think that may have had on how people answered questions, specifically questions related to how religious they say they are? This is speculative, of course.
Well, we have done some polling since. Most of this study was done before all of that happened, even though there was sort of a long tail and a little bit, some of the mail, so stragglers that were mailed in came in, as COVID was sort of ramping up. But mostly this data was collected before that. But I think we have done some surveys since. Kiana, do you want to touch on that, or some of the findings that we found on some of these the later polls on either the George Floyd or the religiosity sort of engagement during COVID?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. So like what you said, we collected the data for this study prior to both the start of the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd. But our team has done other surveying in this area. So last summer we did a study about in terms of religious practice and also race and religion. And one thing that we found related to that is that 2/3 of Black Americans who went to houses of worship regularly had heard a sermon in support of Black Lives Matter. So we do have data on that. In terms of religiosity and COVID in general, we'll be publishing pretty soon in the next couple of months an update to this data. But there are a couple of things that we can draw. Black people in general, and actually most people who attend religious services have said that the pandemic is not going to stop them from going back to church in person. If that was something that they were already doing, they will not be more likely to now go online or to necessarily go to other places. They have viewed services from other places. So they've kind of did that, some people call it sort of the sampler platter. So we have data that demonstrates that people have looked other places, but when it comes down to it and we ask them, do you think that after the pandemic, you will be more likely to go online? And the answer is generally no. So those are some of the things that we have that in terms of the pandemic, people just want to get back to what they were already doing prior to the pandemic. And in terms of race, Black people who go to church are more likely, to hear sermons on race in general. We do have that in the report. But in terms of last summer specifically, they were more likely after George Floyd's death and the protests to have heard sermons in support of Black Lives Matter specifically. 2/3 of them had.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask this question to Pastor Johnson. What are your thoughts about this? How have you, in your position as a senior pastor, how has your work changed? I mean, you hear what Kiana stated about what the data shows since COVID and Black Lives and the emergence of Black Lives Matter protests. But in your experience, what are you saying?
Yeah, the more I sit and listen, I'm still saying, I think it boils down to the questions that we ask and how we ask them. I can definitely see the evolution of some of this from my time spent in Ferguson to now. I guess I think we're all kind of guilty, particularly at those of us who are practitioners, to kind of center ourselves in what our experience in our circle is. And so even with the question about, why wasn't every denomination listed? We're always kind of looking for ourselves in situations. I think that the information that was just highlighted about how people will continue their practices of connection or interaction and engagement, I think those hold well. But there's a part of me that's like, when I read this and I look at what people are saying about their attendance, and what people are saying about their what we would call or identify in on my side of the fence, their disciplines, their practices of faith. There's a part of me that wants to be like, man, how do we drive down? How do we delve deeper? Another example that stood out, I was kind of chopping at the bit earlier. I'm still honing in on the slide that you showed, and you gave the quote from the individual who was the respondent who was in a historically Black denomination, AME Zion. You can't get no blacker than that for some folk, and for them to deduct that they are not in a Black church. There's a part that part of me wants to say, okay, how are you defining Black church? Are you looking at it from the systematic structure? Because Wesleyan tradition, Methodism, while strongly encouraged by people of color, is a historically, or at least a faith that has an origin story that is clearly pointing to something outside of what would be the Americas experience for Black folk. That kind of stuff is what challenges me. I personally think the fact that people are preaching more or preached a sermon after George Floyd. I mean, if you didn't, you probably got accosted, and even if you did, depending if you're in a white congregation, you got accosted. Yeah, this is Ryan and I talked about this offline a little bit. I respect the sociological dimensions to what this is. And I think we who are practitioners need to not be either disgruntled or offended because something personal or something unique to our circle of experience is not necessarily affirmed or addressed. I think I think we, as Ryan noted, the complicated nature, the complex nature, the layered nature of who people are, particularly who identify Black, who are part of that diasporic, and who have a particular experience, meaning this context of the U.S. or America, whether they have commuted or they're not this, they've come into to this life in whatever form, into this this setting, or if they find themselves a native to it. I think this just proves that there are more questions to ask, but more importantly, that this stuff, there's a series of definitions or definings that are unique. I saw one other, and I'll be quiet. I saw some other comments about, how do we differentiate between religiosity and spirituality? I mean, most folk don't know, the lay folk, respectfully, not to but when you talk about religiosity or religion, that's less formal and known than we give credit for in terms of people and their laity. Most people don't know the doctrine of their respective circle or even the tradition that they're in. I can ask multiple Methodists from AME to AME Zion to CME to United Methodists who are all Black, and you will get a bunch of different stuff that will sound more Baptist, that will sound more other than the native or the identified denomination or practice within the denomination. And so that's kind of what has me challenged in this. And I don't know, and it's not your job, lastly, to do this. I think the historical nature of what the Black church is, or how the Black church has come about, which is basically out of a response to anti-Black hatred and oppression, and the fact that the functionality chiefly of the Black church in its earliest state was not to form or make formative the spiritual nature or disposition of people. These people, or our people, my people, came here with religion, with spirituality, and found themselves in relationship and place, and that then began to be formed, shaped, and forged that we now call the Black church. And so some of the things that even people are expecting or responding to bears the question, is that like really the work of a institution or a space, or is that the work of religious, what we would deem as the religious or the faith tradition at hand?
Great point. I appreciate it. Great point. Great point.
Can I add something really quick, Kari? Can I add
Go for it. Yes. Go
something to
ahead.
what,
Yes.
one other thing I do want to say though about because you mentioned about sort of what were people asked and what were the contents of these questions and what did people make of it. I do want to say though that some of this ambiguity that we're finding in our data in terms of Black adults and how they think about the Black church is not only sort of a sociological quirk, right? Because when we did our focus group, so we spent a lot of time. We did 7 focus groups, 2 or 3 hours for each focus group, about 10 people in the focus group, and we asked these types of questions. And people reflected a lot of the things you see. People do make distinctions in terms of the historical institutional role of the Black church, but a lot of people came down, and this is what it came down to for a lot of people: God doesn't exclude anybody. That's what a lot of people said in there, is that, and so in a lot of these, so when you actually talk to people, and that's why we wanted to do these groups, and we did not want to sort of lay our, very comfortable academic definition of the Black church onto regular people, right? And so we went in there wanting to figure out, when we say this, what does this mean to you? And for them, the resistance, and I think this helps explain the 2/3 of people who say they want Black churches to diversify. For them, the resistance to the label is a resistance to being exclusionary. Because a lot of them said, as long as I get the word and some good music, that is church for me. It doesn't matter if the choir is from Japan or if the minister is white, as long as I'm being taught in a way that they felt was credible and authoritative, and as long as I'm feeling welcome and encouraged and inspired. So for them, so absolutely, they want music that we would call Black music, gospel music. They want that. They want that sense of community. They feel like Black churches provide for them. One woman said, our music is powerful because it knows our struggle. That's when the sun is going down. That's why my camera looks weird. So they said, the music is powerful because it knows our struggle. But so for a lot of them, that resistance to the label is a resistance to, they don't want that Black label to feel like they were excluding people from church. Like, this is not a Blacks only church. Yeah. That's what a lot of them felt.
I'm gonna let Ryan jump in here.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ryan.
So the follow-up to that is because what the data shows is that the proportion of Black people, it gives the impression across generations, the proportion of Black people who go to religious spaces with other folks that look like them appears to be declining. We see this from the NCS, National Congregation Study, down. We see more Blacks who are attending religious services in either multiracial or white congregations. If the Black church label is exclusionary, then what do both findings or all these findings have to say about the future of the Black church being defined as a congregation where 75% or more individuals in the pews are Black?
Yeah, just real quick. Just real quick. If the case is this, what you're sharing with us, for those who are practitioners or work to help build out the spaces, the truth is, then we need to adapt both our philosophies and pedagogy on the front line, because pastors, preachers, leaders, people are not orientated that way. They're not, there's a large swath of professionals or practitioners who are not orientating themselves to be adaptive to what your research and this insight is sharing.
Let me ask a follow-up question on this. This is Prima Karen asked this question about immigration, Black immigrants. This really goes to this question about the Black church. So the question basically is, what impact does immigration from Africa and the Caribbean, what impact does that have on people's ideals about what it means to be part of a Black church? What a Black church is? I'll start with, let me ask Bashir and Kim. Let me ask Pastor Johnson his thoughts about this.
You know what? I'm gonna yield to the experts because I've learned over the years this. Yeah, especially from Ryan here on this. I'll yield.
Well, Ryan, what do you think about this?
Well, I think that they're intentionally. So first of all, a good portion of them, because Pew also asked, describe the racial composition of the congregation that you were raised in, right? And so my guess is that a good portion of them weren't raised in quote unquote Black congregations. But I also think that there is so I think Will's point earlier about it reframes, or it should reframe how practitioners try to pitch their church to people. And so one idea, and I've been wondering, is that I believe these people are individually not choosing Black churches. That there is something about going to a Black religious space that they don't want a part of. And if the other panelists agree with that, especially from Pew, what do you think is driving that?
Well, I think there's one bit of nuance, as rich as the data is. I think there's one bit of nuance here that we didn't, that you can't unpack with our core measure of what it means to be in a Black church. Specifically, if we're talking about like African immigrants and the way that their experiences are distinctive, right? I bet you if you went to church in sub-Saharan Africa, you were in a Black church by our definition, because everybody around there was Black, and that's our definition. So in a certain sense, yeah, they went to a Black church. Now, that's not what you mean by Black church. It certainly isn't an African-American Black church. If you're, in Kenya, and, it's a very different
Right.
perspective, but I bet you the congregation was Black,
Right.
and I bet you the leader was Black.
Point. Good point.
And so when they come here, what we didn't ask is whether the leader in the congregation, like, and here I think maybe denomination would get you some of this, but you know, there's a difference between going to a Black church that's like, you know, a historically Black Protestant or a Black American church, and going to a church, you know, that's African immigrants, like, and that's a thing, right? There are churches where like pretty much everybody there, mosques, the same thing. I've been to mosques like this is a Somali mosque. It is what it is. Now, is that the same thing? You go to a Somali mosque, you go to a mosque that's part of the Nation of Islam. Those are both Black mosques, but those are not the same in any way, shape, or form. So I think there's a difference, right, between these folks that are going to a congregation that's sort of ethnically matches them, and that ethnicity is not Black American, and folks that are going to a Black American congregation.
Let me ask you a follow-up on this question in terms of looking at this distinctiveness within, I guess, the Black population as relates to religiosity. So if in your study, if you compare immigrants from Africa, immigrants from the Caribbean to African Americans, what differences did you find in levels of worship attendance, levels of prayer, levels of the social expectation they have for their worship spaces? What differences did you find along those lines?
So I'll just say quickly, and then I'll sort of, I know Ryan had something to say, and I think Kiana may want to jump in as well. So I'll just say quickly, 2 points. One is that broadly speaking, African immigrants tended to be more religious than US born Blacks. Caribbean, significantly more religious. And Caribbean immigrants actually were a little more religious as well, although the gaps were not as reliable or as dramatic as we saw with African immigrants. The other point is that African immigrants, you know, there's some nuance in terms of the types of Black churches they're going to, but they also were more likely to go to white churches. They're also more likely to go to multiracial churches. And some of that, I think, has to do with the fact that they're also more likely to be Catholic. Some of that has to do with the fact that as Protestants, they may be choosing different types of congregations. They may be in different networks. But it is the case that they're also less likely to go to Black congregations than are US born Blacks.
Got it. Thank you. Let's see here. This is a question that you discussed a little bit earlier, but this is an institutional question about the Pew. To what extent will Pew share this research with the heads of denominational groupings or ecumenical organizations like the World Council of Churches or the National Council of Churches? Are you involved in efforts to share your work with those types of organizations?
So that's an easy one. So I'll answer that quickly and let Ryan and Kiana speak to that previous point. The answer is yes, that is absolutely something we want to do. We've reached out to contacts that we've developed, you know, over the years of doing this research, and offered them access. And we're happy to continue to have those conversations. So if there's if the person who asked the question is a representative from one of those organizations and wants to put me in touch with one of those organizations, please feel free, because I'd be happy to do that, to continue to do that. We've been doing it, and I'm happy to do as much of that as I can.
Got it. This is my last question. Like this is okay. We have another question about your qualitative findings. You guys talk quite a bit about the survey findings. Could you talk about any of the interesting findings from the focus groups that you perform with lay people or with pastors?
Yeah, you want to speak to that, or do you want me to?
Sure, I can. The interesting thing. So the biggest thing by far, like I mentioned earlier, was the ambiguity around Black church. We knew going into those focus groups that we wanted to unpack what that phrase meant and how people received it. And the focus groups by far confirmed that that term was contested and that we needed to be very careful how we used it both in question formulation and also in reporting of the results. So that's the biggest thing that we learned. But there are also some other things. In a piece that will come out next week, we did a focus group that was that looked at religious nuns. So those, the atheist agnostics, nothing in particular. Interestingly, that focus group composition was not unlike the sample composition. There was one atheist in that group and everybody else was pretty much nothing in particular. And a lot of discussion in that group was essentially about how people could come to sort of spiritual and religious peace, can find their own spiritual and religious path, either by reliance on self, reliance on friends and families, but explicitly not reliance on religious institutions. So they felt like their own paths in terms of spirituality and religion did not need to be connected to an official institution, organization, or building. So that group, and actually we don't have very much from that group in this report. So my new piece comes out, hopefully y'all will read that. So those are some of the interesting things that we found from the qualitative work.
Great, thank you, I appreciate it. Well, this has been a great discussion, everybody. It's amazing, it's already 4 o'clock. I really appreciate our panelists, Bashir, Kiana, Pastor Johnson, and Ryan, for presenting your work and offering your thoughts on the groundbreaking study. I want to thank everyone that attended and asked these wonderful questions. I apologize that I did not get to all of your questions. Just a couple of things. Bashir and Kiana, where can they find this report based upon your study that you presented today? Can they just go to the Pew website and?
Well, so yes, you can always just go to the Pew website and poke around, but if you do pewresearch.org/blackfaith, one word, it'll bring you directly to the report.
Great, thank you. The last thing that I'll say before we depart is be sure to register for our April 9th webinar on global transnational perspectives on religion. Roman chatted it out to everyone, but he'll send out emails to everyone to remind you to register for that panel discussion. Well, everyone, thanks again. I appreciate all the wonderful questions and I really appreciate the presentation. Have a good weekend.